I think it's crazy. I didn't even know the plague was still something that was going on.
Imagine a silent killer sweeping across continents in the mid-14th century, turning bustling cities into ghost towns and shattering families in the blink of an eye. This was the Black Death, which raged from 1347 to 1353, claiming over half of Europe's population and triggering centuries of chaos, famine, and social collapse. For over 600 years, scholars, scientists, and historians have been obsessed with a single question: what was the cause of this crisis? Where did it all begin? It was only recently, in a mysterious cemetery buried in the Tian Shan mountains of Central Asia, that experts made a startling realization. The mass murderer was not a virus, fungus, or parasite, but a microorganism shaped like a tiny rod. This belated discovery could hold crucial lessons for humanity against the modern pandemics lurking in the shadows. The search for the true beginning of the Black Death did not start in a modern laboratory, but in a forgotten cemetery high in the mountains of Central Asia. In the summer of 1886, a group of Russian archaeologists traveled to the shores of Lake Issyk-Kul in present-day Kyrgyzstan. They were digging at two small burial grounds near a Nestorian Christian trading village. At first, it looked like an ordinary excavation. Yet soon they noticed something unusual: a cluster of graves from the same 2 years, 1338 and 1339. More than 100 people had died in the tiny community in less than 24 months. The stones that marked their resting places carried simple but chilling messages. Some of them included one single word, carved in ancient Syriac script: pestilence. For the villagers, that word meant a mysterious sickness, a force powerful enough to wipe out entire families in a matter of days. The discovery shocked the team. Why had so many lives ended in such a short span of time, long before Europe had even heard of the Black Death? The archaeologists carefully recorded the details, packed away the bones, and shipped them back to a museum in St. Petersburg. But after the notes were filed and the skeletons were stored, the evidence slipped into silence, collecting dust for more than a century. Looking back, the scene at Kyrgyzstan was extraordinary. This was not a quiet farming village cut off from the outside world. The people buried there were part of a trading hub along the Silk Road, one of the busiest networks of exchange in human history. Archaeologists found goods beside the dead: pearls from the Indian Ocean, coins from Persia, and ornaments that had traveled thousands of miles. These items proved the villagers were connected to distant markets, carrying with them not only exotic products but also invisible dangers. The high death toll during those years raised questions that could not be answered at the time. Medieval history showed that Europe's nightmare began in 1347. Yet here was a smaller disaster almost a decade earlier in a remote Asian valley. Was it a coincidence or the first spark of the inferno that would later sweep across continents? For decades, no one could be certain. Without modern tools, the mysterious inscriptions on the stones were just whispers of a story waiting to be told. What made this burial ground even more suspicious was the sheer concentration of losses. In the 2 years recorded, at least 118 people were laid to rest, far more than normal for a small settlement. Tombstones that directly mentioned pestilence made the pattern clear. This was not a random death, it was an outbreak. Still, the old Russian team had no way of knowing that the very bones they unearthed might hold the secret to one of history's greatest mysteries. Time passed, wars raged, and the world moved on, while the skeletal remains stayed hidden in the museum's archives. Generations of scholars debated the Black Death's origin, but the clues sat quietly in wooden drawers, ignored and almost forgotten. It would take the curiosity of a modern historian to bring them back into the light. If one forgotten cemetery could contain the answer to a 600-year-old question, who would finally prove it? The forgotten records from Kyrgyzstan might have stayed buried in dusty archives forever. But one historian refused to let the story end there. His name was Philip Slavin, a medieval historian at the University of Stirling in Scotland. While studying the economic and environmental history of the 14th century, he came across the old excavation notes from 1886. At first, they seemed like routine field reports, yet as he turned the fragile pages, he noticed something that most others had missed. Instead of a random sequence of deaths, the gravestones revealed a sudden disaster, compressed into only 2 years, with the word pestilence written again and again. For Slavin, this was not background noise in history. This was a clue. He decided to dig deeper. Tracing every diary, every map, and every small detail left behind by the Russian archaeologists. When he counted the deaths, he realized that more than 100 lives had been lost in a short window before the Black Death officially entered Europe. No other settlement nearby showed such a spike in mortality. This was not a coincidence, and it pushed him to ask a daring question. Could this small Silk Road community have been ground zero for the most infamous plague in human history? Historians had long argued over the plague's birthplace. Some believed it began near the Black Sea, others claimed China, or even the steppes of Mongolia. Slavin's idea was bold because it challenged centuries of accepted narratives. Still, bold ideas are fragile without proof. His calculations and theories could convince readers of a paper, but they could not silence doubt. What he needed was something stronger than speculation, something that could survive scientific scrutiny. That missing piece was DNA. The skeletons stored in St. Petersburg were more than dry bones. They were time capsules, carrying microscopic traces of the pathogens that had killed their owners. Slavin knew that if scientists could extract genetic material from those remains, they might be able to confirm the presence of the plague bacterium itself. But historians are not geneticists, and the work required advanced technology. To turn his suspicion into evidence, he needed partners who could look directly into the biological past. At the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany, paleogeneticists were already building a genetic family tree of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the Black Death. They had collected more than 1,000 samples from rodents, humans, and archaeological sites around the world. When they heard Slavin's theory, they realized how important those Kyrgyz graves could be. If the bones contained the right genetic markers, they could solve a mystery that had haunted science and history for 6 centuries. Working with Russian colleagues who guarded the collections, the team gained access to the remains that had been hidden away for more than 100 years. The challenge was enormous. DNA degrades quickly, and after 7 centuries, only tiny fragments survive. Yet teeth offered a chance. Inside the pulp chamber, traces of blood-borne pathogens can remain sealed away, protected from the outside world. If any sample could reveal the truth, it would be the teeth of those who died in 1338 and 1339. Slavin had transformed an old observation into a serious hypothesis, and now the weight of proof shifted to science. It was no longer about reading inscriptions or counting gravestones. It was about reaching into the cells of the dead and asking them to speak across time. The stakes were clear. If the DNA matched the plague, the mystery of the Black Death's beginning would finally have an answer. But what would the test reveal when the ancient teeth were opened? And would the evidence be strong enough to rewrite history? The moment of truth came when scientists finally placed the ancient teeth under their microscopes and began the delicate work of unlocking their secrets. The team at the Max Planck Institute drilled into the pulp chambers of 7 individuals buried in Kyrgyzstan between 1338 and 1339. It was slow and careful because even the smallest mistake could destroy what little genetic material remained. Yet when the samples were processed and sequenced, 3 of them revealed something extraordinary. They carried the unmistakable genetic fingerprint of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death, also known as the plague. For the first time in history, a direct line could be drawn from the graves of Central Asia to the pandemic that later tore Europe apart. The scientists were not satisfied with simply proving the disease was present. They wanted to know exactly what kind of plague had struck that Silk Road settlement. By comparing the recovered DNA with their vast genetic database, they reconstructed a complete genome of the ancient bacterium. What they found sent shockwaves through the world of science. The strain from those graves was not just any plague strain. It was the common ancestor, the source of a massive diversification event that had created 4 new branches of plague in the early 14th century. This discovery meant that the outbreak in Kyrgyzstan was not a side note in history. It was the trigger point, the explosion that set the stage for 4 centuries of recurring epidemics. The European strains that killed millions were shown to be descendants, separated by only 1 or 2 genetic mutations from the original strain identified in those ancient teeth. The plague that reshaped the course of civilization could now be traced back to a single origin point, locked in time and place. To understand the weight of this finding, imagine the plague family tree as a massive trunk splitting into several branches. The DNA from Kyrgyzstan sat right at the base of that trunk, the mother strain from which everything else grew. Without it, there would have been no Black Death in Europe, no later resurgences across Asia and Africa, and no centuries of fear that followed. For scientists who had searched for the origin of this pathogen for decades, it was the smoking gun they had been waiting for. The evidence also silenced many of the older theories. Some historians had believed the plague had been circulating in Europe itself before 1347, while others claimed it began far to the east in China. The genetic analysis showed otherwise. Europe's strains were too young, already slightly altered versions of the ancestor. China's strains, meanwhile, diverged earlier and did not match the critical timeline. Only the graves in Kyrgyzstan matched perfectly, both in date and in genetic identity. What made this discovery so powerful was the way it combined disciplines. Archaeology had uncovered the bones, history had noticed the strange inscriptions, and genetics had finally spoken the decisive word. Together they rewrote one of the greatest mysteries in human history. The forgotten villagers of Kyrgyzstan were no longer anonymous victims. They were the first known casualties of a chain reaction that would kill more than half of Europe's people and echo through generations. Yet even with the origin point identified, another question rose sharply. How did a bacterium living quietly in rodents leap so violently into humans and spread across continents with unstoppable force? Finding the ancestral strain of the plague explained where the Black Death began, but it did not explain how a quiet bacterium living in animals exploded into humanity. To answer that, scientists had to look closely at the environment of the Tian Shan mountains, where nature had been setting the stage for centuries. The region around Lake Issyk-Kul has always been a natural plague reservoir. In these valleys, wild rodents like marmots and gerbils carry Yersinia pestis in their blood, passing it silently among themselves through fleas. Normally, the cycle stays hidden in the animal kingdom, erupting only in occasional small outbreaks. But something changed in the early 14th century. Evidence points to climate shifts that made the area unusually warm and wet. Such conditions turned the mountain grasslands into fertile fields, sparking a sudden population boom among rodents. More rodents meant more fleas, and more fleas meant more chances for the bacterium to multiply. When rodent populations rise too quickly, food becomes scarce and animals push closer to human settlements. Hunters in the region often killed marmots for their fur and meat, not knowing they were handling one of the deadliest carriers of disease on Earth. Fleas feeding on infected marmots jumped onto dogs, camels, and eventually people. In that moment, the quiet cycle of infection broke its natural barrier. The plague had crossed over. This process, known today as zoonotic spillover, has happened with many modern diseases. Scientists believe the same basic pattern triggered Ebola outbreaks in Africa and even the origins of COVID-19. But in the 14th century, nobody understood pathogens, and nobody could see the invisible threat riding in the blood of a flea. For the villagers in Kyrgyzstan, the sickness must have seemed like a curse that came out of nowhere. Within weeks, neighbors and family members would collapse, covered in black swellings and burning with fever. Panic spread faster than knowledge, and whole households disappeared before anyone could act. The perfect storm was not only biological, but also social. The Silk Road connected Central Asia with markets thousands of miles away. Caravans moved constantly through the Tian Shan valleys, stopping at trade posts and villages. Animals loaded with goods often carried rats hidden in the packs. Those rats, in turn, carried fleas infected with the plague. A single caravan could become a moving bomb of contagion, rolling slowly across the mountains and deserts toward distant cities. Scientists studying the Kyrgyz outbreak stressed that the plague was not created by human hands, but human activity gave it the pathways it needed. Trade routes, population density, and the demand for fur all played a part. Without them, the bacterium might have remained locked in its natural reservoir, deadly only to rodents. Instead, human contact and climate change unlocked the door, and once opened, there was no turning back. Understanding this mechanism is not just about solving a medieval mystery. It carries urgent lessons for today. The same forces that shaped the Black Death still operate in the modern world. Climate change continues to shift animal populations, bringing species into new contact zones. Global trade moves faster than any medieval caravan, carrying not only products but also microbes across oceans in hours. The Black Death reminds us that when environmental stress meets human networks, diseases can leap forward with catastrophic results. The spillover in the Tian Shan mountains was the spark, but it did not yet explain how the flame became an inferno that consumed Europe. To see that final transformation, we must follow the caravans westward. Watch the siege at Kaffa in 1346 and trace the moment the plague entered Europe's crowded ports. But how exactly did an outbreak in a remote mountain valley travel thousands of kilometers to unleash terror on medieval cities? Once the plague jumped from animals to people in Central Asia, the question was not whether it would spread, but how far it could travel. The answer lay in the arteries of trade and war that tied the medieval world together. The Nestorian community near Lake Issyk-Kul was not an isolated village. It was part of the Silk Road, a network that stretched across deserts, mountains, and seas. Caravans passed through its valley carrying silk, spices, gems, and coins, moving slowly westward. But hidden among the cargo were stowaways that nobody noticed. Black rats clung to the loads of grain and fur, while fleas carrying Yersinia pestis waited patiently for their next host. Every mile that the caravans traveled extended the reach of the disease. By the mid-1345s, this chain of transmission reached the Crimean Peninsula, where Genoese merchants had built a bustling port city called Kaffa. The city sat on the Black Sea and served as a crucial link between Europe and Asia. In 1346, Kaffa came under siege by the Mongol army. Historical records describe a horrifying tactic. The attackers, themselves weakened by the plague, began catapulting the corpses of their dead over the city walls. Whether or not this was the first act of biological warfare in history, it was certainly effective. the disease quickly spread among the crowded population trapped inside the walls. From there, the plague took to the sea. Genoese ships fleeing the siege carried not only sailors and cargo, but also rats infected with plague-bearing fleas. These vessels sailed across the Mediterranean, stopping at Constantinople, Alexandria, and finally the ports of Italy. Wherever they docked, death followed. By 1347, the sickness had entered Europe, and within a year it was racing across the continent. Europe was especially vulnerable. Its cities were packed with people and livestock, sanitation was poor, and food shortages had already weakened communities. The conditions created an environment where rats could thrive, multiplying in homes, warehouses, and ships. Once the rodents carrying the bacterium found new hosts, the chain reaction was unstoppable. Records from the time describe entire neighborhoods emptied in weeks, with priests and doctors dying alongside beggars and merchants. By 1353, more than half of Europe's population had vanished. The journey from Kyrgyzstan to Europe shows how interconnected the medieval world truly was. What began in one mountain valley could cross thousands of kilometers, moving through caravans, sieges, and ships until it reached the heart of Western civilization. The Black Death was not just a biological event, it was also a product of trade routes, political conflict, and human mobility. Without those networks, the bacterium might have remained a regional outbreak. With them, it became one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. Yet even with the path of spread now clear, another mystery remained. Scientists could trace how the plague traveled, but they also wanted to know what made this outbreak so explosive compared to earlier ones. Why did this particular strain cause such devastation, and what could modern genetics reveal about its unique power? Proving that the Kyrgyzstan cemetery held the ancestor of the Black Death was a breakthrough, but it also opened a new chapter of questions. The genetic data did not just confirm where the plague began. It reshaped how scientists understand the evolution of one of history's most feared pathogens. When researchers compared the ancient genome to modern samples, they discovered that nearly 40% of today's plague diversity descends from the 14th century polytomy, the branching explosion that started in Central Asia. In other words, almost half of the living strains around the world still carry the genetic fingerprints of that single outbreak. This shows that the Black Death was not just a medieval disaster. It created a lasting genetic legacy that continues to influence the disease even now.
Here's one of 2 reported in the last 6 weeks.
The Kyrgyz strain sits at the exact node where the bacterium splits into 4 branches. Each of those branches later appeared in different regions across Eurasia and Africa, causing repeated waves of epidemics. The European strains that devastated cities like Florence, Paris, and London were only a few mutations away from the ancestor identified in Kyrgyzstan. The precision of the genetic match left little room for doubt, and it gave scientists the kind of proof that historians had been chasing for centuries. Still, not everyone accepts the new narrative without challenge. For years, some scholars argued that the plague might have originated in Mongolia or even China during the early 13th century, spreading west with the Mongol Empire. Others believed that it could have been circulating silently in European rodent populations before 1347. These theories had seemed reasonable when only historical records were available, but the genome evidence has pushed them aside. By showing that the European samples were already descendants of the Kyrgyz strain, scientists ruled out the idea of an independent European origin. The debate, however, has not completely ended, because some researchers continue to argue that earlier outbreaks may have involved related strains that left no surviving record. What makes this discovery so powerful is the way it combines multiple fields of knowledge. Archaeologists unearthed the graves, historians identified the strange timing and inscriptions, and geneticists provided the final confirmation through advanced sequencing. Without all three working together, the story would still be incomplete. It is a reminder that history is not just written in books, but also in bones, soil, and molecules. The results also highlight how much global history depends on natural forces. Climate shifts in the Tian Shan mountains created the spark, trade routes carried the fire, and genetic mutations provided the fuel that kept the plague burning for centuries. The pandemic was not simply an accident of geography, but the result of multiple systems colliding. This lesson speaks loudly today, when climate change and global trade once again create new opportunities for diseases to jump between species and continents. The Kyrgyz discovery did more than solve an old puzzle. It provided a warning. If a single spillover in a mountain valley could reshape the medieval world, then what could modern spillovers do in our connected age of air travel and megacities? The Black Death shows how one genetic shift in one pathogen can redirect the future of entire civilizations. Yet even with the science complete and the debates narrowing, one final question remains. What lessons does this story carry for us today, and how can uncovering the past prepare us for the pandemics of the future? The journey to pinpoint the origin of the Black Death stands as a testament to interdisciplinary triumph. From mysterious inscriptions in a Kyrgyzstan cemetery, historian Philip Slavin's curiosity revived a forgotten clue, guiding geneticists to irrefutable evidence. The Yersinia pestis strain in those ancient graves was the direct ancestor of the devastating pandemic. This discovery, solving a 600-year-old mystery, offers a profound lesson in connectivity. A climate shift in a remote mountain region, combined with burgeoning global trade networks, created a perfect storm for spillover. Through collaboration, relentless curiosity, and advanced technology, humanity can decipher its most complex challenges. Understanding the intricate dance between environmental change, human activity, and pathogen evolution is our most powerful tool to build a more resilient future against emerging global health threats.